I think they probably knew what they were getting into. I think it's not a military alliance. It's a strategic partnership that they signed for 20 years.
Now, for years, Iran has supplied Russia with thousands of drones and other weapons to support Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. In return, Moscow is expected to offer political cover and military defences that would shield Tehran from Western pressure and possible US strikes. So now, some in Tehran are asking, was this strategic partnership really mutual? Has Vladimir Putin betrayed the Iranian regime? Well, Luc Barnes is a journalist and the author of Farewell to Russia, A Journey Through the Former USSR, which we'll come to shortly. But Joe, hello.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. First, let's look at the geopolitical fallout of what we're seeing at the moment. President Putin, he's condemned the US strikes, but beyond rhetoric, is he realistically willing or able to do anything?
No, I think this is probably a good demonstration of the limits of the idea of Russia as a world power. It's definitely potentially a spoiler in the world, but it's definitely a regional power with quite a lot on its plate at the moment. And this 20-year strategic partnership that they signed with Iran last year, it didn't result in any military aid to Iran during the Israeli-American bombings last year. So I'd say there's a limited amount that Russia would do. Yeah.
I mean, Tehran would be just not that we may have much sympathy for them, but they would be justified in feeling somewhat peeved by this, wouldn't they?
I think they probably knew what they were getting into. I think it's not a military alliance. It's a strategic partnership that they signed for 20 years. And like you say, you were mentioning the drones earlier. They did sell a lot of these Shahed drones to Russia at the start of the war, but Russia has now started producing a lot of them themselves. There's this huge facility in Tatarstan, sort of around the Ural Mountains. So Russia doesn't need Iran necessarily so much for military aid so much at the moment. It's more the trade, the sanctions evasion, the logistics that Iran offers in terms of giving Russia access to the Indian Ocean and its ports there. We don't really know how this war will pan out, but that's definitely what Russia is probably wary about, losing access to those routes.
I mean, so the value of that relationship then to Russia. So, I mean, Iran's got its various sort of proxy groups around the Middle East, Hezbollah, militants in Iraq and Syria, Hamas and the Houthis and so on. Do they advance Russian interests in any sort of tangible way, or are they simply what Iran's up to, or Russia is up to its own things, and their interests merely coincide because they're both, as far as much of the rest of the world is concerned, pariah nations?
Yeah, I couldn't speak for Iran, but neither would I claim to be a Putin whisperer. But I would say that they're very practical in their alliances. This so-called axis that we had, or that was so-called with countries like Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, China. You'll notice that three of them now have lost their leaders in the last year and a half.
Yeah.
And Russia seems to be able to work with whatever new regime has come in. They've worked reasonably well with the new regime in Syria, have kept their port in Tartus there. And one would imagine that unless we get a complete flip of the government in Iran and end up with some sort of pro-Western government, that Russia will be able to work with whoever's in power in Iran.
So there wouldn't be sort of terror in Russia, that they're gradually losing their sort of reliable allies around the world. Do you think they're much more adaptable than that?
I think they're adaptable. I'd also say they potentially see some opportunities in what is happening at the moment. I think the oil price has gone up at 12%. It could rise a lot further, and although the oil price doesn't, or revenues don't necessarily contribute as much as they once did to the Russian budget, it's still a bit of a boon. And there's also the sort of moral victory that Russia can claim, where they can now point to the United States and Israel having gone on an unprovoked, I might be on shaky ground here, but probably illegal attack on another country, and say, well, this is what you had to go at us for doing 4 years ago. Let's turn now to your book. You spent years travelling the 14 republics that became independent nations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a vast area. I'm fascinated by what, if anything, you found they all had in common. What connects like a Muslim living near the Chinese border in Tajikistan with an Estonian living by the Baltic Sea? Is there anything there? Yeah, there's definitely quite a few things they have in common. I'd probably say there's 15 republics, as Russia became independent, and in some ways pushed independence. Russia was looking to get rid of some of the what it saw as a burden of supporting nations in Central Asia, which is ironic now because it seeks influence in them. But what do they share? One thing, having lived there, is definitely this is sort of a communist legacy, an appreciation for high art that should be publicly accessible. So I don't know, you go to I don't know. I watched the Barber of Seville recently in Almaty in Kazakhstan. It must have been about £2 to go and see. And imagine that in London. Other than that, you referenced the 14 republics. There's definitely a sense that all of them are kind of looking over their shoulder and looking at developments in Russia. There's economic links that are still there. There's, in most of them, the Russian language is still something that binds people together. Potentially that's less strong amongst young generations in the Baltic states or in Georgia. But yeah, I'd say those are the things that tend to bind people together, as well as a sort of shared history and experience of having lived under communism.
There's a lot of political divergence. I mean, some of them see Russia as a threat. Some of them are still quite close to Russia. Which of those is more often true?
More often true. I'd say generally you could break it down to regime type. If it's a more autocratic country, it's more comfortable dealing with Russia, not necessarily using Russia as a support or a crutch, but knows how the Russian regime works, knows how an authoritarian regime works, isn't necessarily trying to join any clubs that are perceived as anti-Russian, EU, NATO, and things like that. Whereas in the more democratic countries, the Baltic states very early threw their lot in with the EU and NATO. Countries such as Moldova are moving towards the EU. Georgia has done quite a few volte-faces, but is currently moving towards a more authoritarian regime. But who knows where that will go? Whereas Armenia is currently quite democratic and moving westward. So I'd say regime type is quite a good predictor.
I'm fascinated by that generational shift you mentioned as well. Do younger people just have much less of a, I don't know, sort of historic fondness, affinity with the whole sort of Soviet Union concept?
Yeah, I mean, they haven't experienced it. I imagine if you were born in a newly independent country and you were told, oh, there was this other country that we lived in, you might say, well, that's
so
not
what?
our...
That's
so
nice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas, let's say you're 60 years old, you would have been 25 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Some of your best years of your life, in your teens, early 20s, you've lived in the Soviet Union and you probably didn't think it was the worst place. And especially with older generations, they remember things like rent being either free or a lot cheaper. They remember everyone having jobs. They remember local communities built around certain industries and factories. Whereas now it's a lot more cutthroat in a capitalist world, and that's harder to adapt to. Older generations obviously went through the chaos of the transition, and in the 1990s, there was huge economic disorder, and that was a sort of sink or swim moment for a lot of people. A lot of people really, really suffered. Obviously, you had a few people who became billionaires. So yeah, really, it's a real variety of experiences.
And finally, is the change done? Like, are there other areas that are still not technically actually part of Russia? The areas that are sort of quasi-autonomous that could wish to become entirely independent. Is the fracture finished?
I wouldn't want to predict the future. There are areas of Russia that are quasi-autonomous. That might wish to become independent. Obviously, Chechnya is the most famous one, but there are. I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but there are definitely dozens of different ethnic groups in Russia. In the same way that I wouldn't want to put a guess on what would happen to the future of the United Kingdom.
Sure.
So there's more than one country in this situation.
That does bring it back down to earth. Luc Barnes, thank you very much indeed. The book is Farewell to Russia, A Journey Through the Former USSR. It's out tomorrow. It's available at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.co.uk. Thank you very much indeed, Joe.